Hello.
Hey, Simon.
Hey, Simon. It's Skylar. How you doing?
Hello, Simon.
What's up, Simon?
Hello.
How you doing?
Hey.
Hello.
Simon.
Hello, Simon.
Hello, Simon.
This is Conversations with Storytellers, a podcast of wisdom, thoughts, and folk and fairy tales from our elders, and I am your host, Simon Brooks. This is a meeting with professional storytellers, people who, for their work, travel about telling myths and legends, folk and fairy tales. Each storyteller shares their thoughts on our profession and gems of wisdom and, sometimes, a story or two. I'm glad that you're here. Judith Heineman and I met years ago at Sharing the Fire, the Northeastern Storytelling Conference, and bonded over stories and dark chocolate. It was at a time when I always had some on me and some other person let her know. Judith started as a poet and an actor and has gone deep with her work as a storyteller. We talk about research, books, kids, energy and the jitters, amongst other topics. Please enjoy this conversation. Judith, welcome to Conversations with Storytellers. Thanks very much indeed for being here with me today. I'm very excited.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, you're welcome. So Judith and I met a long time ago at Sharing the Fire, and we kind of bonded, and we've been on and off friends. And I only mean that in the way that we don't see each other very often, but we've been on and off friends ever since then. And it's been a glorious relationship. And our main bond, I have to say, other than storytelling, is
chocolate.
Chocolate. We both discovered that we have a deep, abiding passion for chocolate. So what's your favorite chocolate? That's going to be my first question for you, Judith. Let's get into the deep stuff, the important stuff. What's your favorite kind of chocolate?
I suppose anything that's not white chocolate. No, I like dark chocolate. I like milk chocolate. I love fudge. I love the chocolate that's in the middle of ice cream. There was a cake that was originally made by a bakery in Long Island called Ebinger's, and it was a blackout cake, and it had delicate crumbs, yielding pudding layers, and it's pudding and mousse and chocolate, and that sends me to heaven too. So it's a combination of chocolate mousse and chocolate pudding and chocolate, but I'll have anything with chocolate.
Sounds like it.
I write poetry about chocolate. I have a poem. It's called "It's Not Enough." So
I have the same thing. My wife says, "You have too many chocolate bars," but they always seem to vanish very quickly. So I don't think I do.
What's your favorite chocolate?
My favorite. That's easy. Green and blacks.
Uh-huh.
And if they want to sponsor me, I'm very happy with that.
I'm not familiar. Is it a British brand?
It's European. I used to think it was British, but I don't think it is. I think it's Scandinavian, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's definitely European, and it's kind of fair trade and all that kind of stuff. It's ethically sourced chocolate, which is good because unethically sourced chocolate is not good.
Right.
But yeah, so yeah, that's anyway. Let's get down to the nitty gritty of storytelling, shall we? So when you were a wee lass, were there any storytellers in your family?
Yes. So my grandfather. So I have this foundation story. It's which you have seen. There's a story about my grandfather, Oscar Markowitz, that's called A Yiddish King Lear, and if you, it's available on YouTube. Nestor Gomez has a program called 80 Minutes Around the World. It's an immigration themed program. And I did it live for him in November of 2019 on Lower East Side of Manhattan at a place called Caveat. And what's interesting is that location is pretty much ground zero for where the story really took place almost 100 years ago. And so the influence was my grandfather, Oscar Markowitz, who was an actor in the Yiddish theater, and I did not remember it until many, many years later when I was a struggling actress. And I kept wondering, why was I doing this? Why was it so difficult? And truly, his voice came flooding back to me in a language I didn't understand, which was Yiddish. And I remembered all the stories he told me about acting in the theater and all these well-known personalities, Stella Adler and the Schiffs and so on. And then I realized it was in my blood. And I sort of came by it honestly, that he was my role model. He was the storyteller in the family. And that's sort of where I think my passion and my love of story was. And it was deeply embedded in the recesses of my DNA.
That's really cool. Were there any other storytellers that you remember in your family other than your grandfather?
No, not to that extent. Not to that extent where it was just so obvious and so blatant. People, actually, that's not true. My mother's brother, he was quite a character. He was almost like a Damon Runyon character, if you know what that is.
No.
See Guys and Dolls. If you have ever seen the movie Guys and Dolls, you should see it. It's all these sort of pool sharks and sort of low-life characters, not really gangsters, but anyway. So he was a lovely man, and he also regaled me with stories, and he had a great voice, and he sang beautifully. But growing up in Brooklyn, he also knew a couple of the Brooklyn gangsters, and supposedly he spent a lot of time in pool halls. So he regaled me with some of those stories. So I suppose some of that became part of my DNA. That was my mother's brother.
I like that. Yeah, we've got one of those in our family as well. It's interesting to find these characters, isn't it?
Yes.
So you although you do tell personal stories now, you started off telling folk and fairy tales, right?
When I started off as an actor, so I was doing one-woman shows, and when I lived in Los Angeles, I was one of the co-founders of the Los Angeles Women's Theater Festival, and I was doing a personal story, an expanded 45-minute show based on this story I just told you called The Yiddish King Lear, but it was a full-out dramatic piece, and with lighting and blocking and props and costumes and voiceovers and things like that. So I was doing a personal narrative in a theatrical format. And then, and it's really interesting, when I was co-founding the Los Angeles Women's Theater Festival, Vicki Judith and Milbury Birch were among some of the very first actors that we hired in the early 90s.
Really? Milbury was in that gang?
Yes, Milbury did Mom's the Word, and it was sort of a theater piece for half an hour. It was a festival for women for half an hour. Actually, my piece would have been a half an hour. So I met Milbury way back in the early 90s when she lived in LA. And so there's if you know Karen Golden and some other storytellers from Los Angeles, I knew them then. They invited me to storytelling programs, and I said, I don't do that. I was originally a performance poet, and I was an actor. And then when I moved to Chicago, I wound up going to the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee, all by myself. It's a whole other story. And I met Peg O'Sullivan, who told me about Celebration. I brought Celebration to Chicago for the first time. And one of the first storytellers I saw was Angela Lloyd. And she was dancing around with her sunbrella, which is an umbrella with no covering. It was open to the sun, and she had different colored scarves on, hanging from it and twirling around. And she was telling poetry, including poetry and stories. And I thought, this is something I can do, because I had just come off being a member of this poetry performance ensemble for 15 years and then starting to do my own poetry. And my two loves of theater, story, and poetry I saw could possibly be meshed together. So anyway, when I was there, I saw Donald Davis, and I saw Ed Stuyvesant, and I saw all these other wonderful storytellers, and Ray Hicks. He was there at the time. And I realized, oh my gosh, it just grabbed me around the neck and didn't let me go. And I realized I could take my one-woman show and switch it into this genre. I could tweak it into this storytelling genre. So technically, I started in the storytelling world with a personal story.
Yeah, that's funny. So how did you get into the folk tales and myths and legends and all that kind of stuff?
Well, so then when I was in Chicago, and I founded the Celebration and the Chicago Storytelling Guild, at that time, Lauren Nemi was living in Chicago, Joseph Sobel was living in Chicago, and they all came to these meetings. And we just shared stories. And coincidentally, at that same time, the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which is the repository of Near Eastern studies, knew I was a storyteller and was doing a family program for the new exhibit called Treasures from the Royal Tombs of Ur, U-R, that these artifacts from ancient Mesopotamia had just been unearthed. The bull-headed lyre, the ram in the thicket, or whatever. And the education director wanted Mesopotamian and Egyptian stories. And so I started doing research. And then that's when Dan Marcotte, my musician, wandered into our Storytelling Guild meeting. He was very young. He was just pretty much out of graduate school. And he was a bard. He was actually a bard and plays 60 instruments. And he could play the Renaissance lute. He could play the Egyptian oud, the doumbek drum, the kinnor harp, all the instruments that would be good for the Middle Eastern storytelling. So we got a grant from the Illinois Arts Council. We spent a year doing research, and I was asked by the director to put on the full regalia, wig, dress, the whole thing. I looked like Cleopatra. And so those were the folk tales and fairy tales, the legends of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. So I came to do those. And at the same time, I can't remember how, we were asked to do stories or Halloween stories. And I was an avid reader, and I loved Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen, and I loved all these stories as a kid. And for somehow, I can't remember exactly, we were asked to do campfire stories. And both Dan and I loved the Grimm fairy tales. And we just started rehearsing them and getting together and telling the Grimm fairy tales. And Dan even created original bloody choruses. I would say, Dan, I need a bloody chorus in the middle of the real Sleeping Beauty. And he'd go away, and an hour later come back with a munch and a crunch on the bones and flesh, a munch and a crunch on the meat so fresh. You know, eat your daughter-in-law with rice, the real story of Sleeping Beauty, which is on our CD. And so then Grimm became one of my touchstones. And in fact, in 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing 2 live performances after almost a year of plus of Zooming storytelling, be doing the Grimm stuff. So the Grimm fairy tales, the Mesopotamian and Egyptian fairy tales, and then I started getting hired to do programs. And so I read and read and read hundreds and hundreds of folk tales and fairy tales and developed a lot of different programs to do it for all ages, for little ones to seniors. And what's interesting too, there was a wonderful storyteller who actually used to work with Lauren Nemi, who came from Minnesota, whose name was John Berquist. He was a folklorist, he was a musician, a composer. And when he lived and I lived in Chicago, we were hired through a Rothschild Family Foundation grant to do storytelling in senior centers and nursing homes. And so we toured seniors for 10 years, doing a series of at least a dozen nursing homes and senior centers every year. And I cooked up folktales and fairy tales for that were highly interactive. So some of these very compromised nursing home residents and seniors could relate. But then when John played music, they really came alive, and we integrated the music and stories. And I have always had music, I realized, as another voice in all of the types of performances that I've done. So even when I was doing performance poetry, I had musicians who improvised with me and did improvisational music while I told poetry.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's really cool. So even from the very first thing that you did, it sounds like music has played a very important role in your work.
Coincidentally and sort of unplanned.
Right.
It really... my stepfather was a professional musician. He was a trumpet player, and I don't know that has any influence. I played the violin as a kid, but I somehow always worked in an ensemble where there was a musician, and it enhanced whatever programs I was doing. So I've always tried to incorporate it. Even when I was producing Telebration, I always had musicians who were part of the storytelling evening. And then for 13 years here, where I am in New York, this historic community, I produced the Mohegan Colony Storytelling and Music Festival. And we did that for 13 years and always had musicians as part of. So if you're familiar with the Story Crafters, Barry Marshall and Jerry Burns, so they used to come every year to the Mohegan Storytelling and Music Festival. And they have a wonderful way that they do music and stories and instrumentation as well.
So you mentioned Telebration a couple of times, so people who are listening might not really know what Telebration is. It was actually something, I'm trying to find the guy's name now, but it started off in Connecticut.
Peg O'Sullivan and Paw Pinkerton were the founders in Connecticut in 1988. And
J.G. Pinkerton, I just found it right now, yeah.
And he familiarly was called Paw Pinkerton, and he had a nickname. And so it was Peg who started it with J.G. Pinkerton in 1988 in multiple sites in Connecticut. And I think they had 6 or 8 the very first year they introduced it in different locations in Connecticut. And then I met her in 96, I believe, 96 or 97, when I was in Chicago. And that's when I went to the National Storytelling Festival and met her. And she had a little button she was wearing saying, "Ask me about Telebration." And I did. And I learned that it was
a few of those buttons too, yeah. And Telebration, it's basically held, it's preferably on a certain date. And I can't think it's in November, if I remember right.
Yeah, it's usually the weekend before Thanksgiving.
It's the weekend before Thanksgiving, but it can be like during that week. So I think this year, 2021, it's the 20th of November.
It's usually the weekend before Thanksgiving. And I always did it on a Sunday because I was near the University of Chicago and their homecoming was Saturday. And I did not want to conflict with that. Yeah. And
that's a good thinking.
And it was originally intended as storytelling for grown-ups. It was storytelling for adults. That was the original impetus, because they said children had stories but adults didn't. And it was the one night a year that professional tellers were to give back to the community without benefit of pay. And that was the only way I could afford to do a $30,000 production, for maybe $2,000, where, I needed to use for publicity and Xeroxing at that time and giving money to the space that we use, different churches and different places, and for food and things like that. But everybody donated their services and educated the public about storytelling for grown-ups. And 25 years ago, it was not that common. Now it's become, much more, and especially with personal narrative and personal storytellings, it's a very much an adult type of thing. But then it wasn't really. Yeah, no,
I do get that. So, do you have any favorite stories that you remember from your childhood?
Yes, I was an avid fan of Nancy Drew, and I loved mysteries, and I loved reading Nancy Drew. But the folktale that haunted me, that I could envision but did not remember the name, was actually a Grimm tale. And I remember a young girl falling down a well and coming out on the other side with beautiful flowers. And then there was all kinds of conflict. And then I ultimately found it, and it was Mother Holle, Holle. And there are many variants of it, like Diamonds and Toads, and about 2 girls, one very kind and one mean and selfish, and how one is showered in gold or jewels, or when she opens her mouth, flowers and jewels come out, where the other sister or the other girl in the story walks under an archway and tar falls on her, or she opens her mouth and toads and snakes and vipers come out of her mouth. So the story, one of the first stories that I remember loving and being very interested in. And then when I found it back in the Grimm canon, I was very excited about that.
Yeah, it's a good story. Is that how you pronounce it? Hole?
Mother Hole.
Okay.
I remember it.
Okay. Yeah, I always call it Holly, but I could be totally wrong. It's not. It wouldn't be the first time I was totally wrong, but I think Hole is probably more accurate, to be honest. Yeah, that's a good story. It is a good story. So, and you tell that one now, presumably.
No, I don't really. I would like to. I really should. I should go back to it and tell it, but it's not really. I have told it, but it's not really part of my repertoire, but I'd love to revisit it. And then I do remember when I was a very little girl, I went to sleepaway camp, even at a very young age, and I was sick, and I was in the infirmary, and I must have been 8 years old, and a very handsome counselor. His name was Mel, I remember, blonde and blue-eyed. And for some reason, he came into the infirmary. He used to read me stories. And he read the Nightingale and the Rose. And that story of the nightingale pressing his chest against the thorn of the rose and dying, that's another story that was very, very early embedded in me. And I was just infatuated with this handsome counselor, at least 10 years older than I was, as he read me these beautiful fairy tales.
That's so neat. Did you at the summer camp? Did you get into performance much? Was that one of the? How did you get up into the theater? I guess is a better question.
Well, actually, it was much later on when I was a teenager in a different summer camp, and there was a drama teacher, and I was very fond of him, and also I was always interested in theater. I played the violin from the 4th grade until I graduated high school. And I loved it. It was quite a unique public school in the South Bronx that had an amazing music program where we had academic courses in the morning and orchestra all afternoon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But I realized I did not have a great ear for music. I wasn't bad, but I knew when I got to college that I would not be good enough for the college orchestra. And so that's when I got out of the pit and onto the stage. So I was always interested in drama. I was always dramatic. I always loved doing recitations and poetry and theater, and I loved Shakespeare. And so I wanted to be an actor. I really did want to be an actor. But when I was growing up, I didn't really get a lot of family support for it. So my mother always said, you have to have something practical to fall back on.
Yes. So, show me a family that has excelled at supporting someone that wants to become an actor. There are very few and far between, I would say.
I'm a high school English and journalism teacher. And part of that story that I mentioned, the Yiddish King Lear, tells about the evolution of my journey, teaching during the day and then acting at night, off Broadway, off Broadway, and having sort of a dual personality, a little schizophrenic, teacher, pulled back ponytail during the day, tight-fitting leotards and things at night, doing off Broadway and off Broadway. So I always wanted to act, and so I did combine it for many years. And then when I found storytelling, it was another avenue, another slice of this sort of dramatic life that I could pursue. Yeah.
So with Grimm and the Magic Carpet, you were doing these, or certainly with the Magic Carpet, you were doing these Sumerian tales. What kind of research were you doing to resource these, to find these tales?
So the education director of the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, which is one of the leading resources of Middle Eastern studies, was my mentor. She took me under her wing. She guided us. And in fact, she gave me a list of stories that she wanted me to research. And I had professors in Sumerian literature sending me prefaces of their books before they were being published. We also did the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I must have read 11 different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And
wow.
And at the University of Chicago's museum, the Oriental Institute is a museum as well. It's a public museum. The original cuneiform tablets that had chapters from the Epic of Gilgamesh were there. So I actually saw the original tablets, and we even performed this program in the museum at the University of Chicago at this Oriental Institute with the original cuneiform tablets behind us and surrounded by these lamassu from Persepolis and so on. And so she guided me, and Dan and I read, and we read these different stories, Sekhmet, and one of the ones I like very much is called it has two titles. It could either be The Clever Thief or I just forgot for a moment what the other one was, but it was The Clever Thief, and it was about the Treasure Thief. I think it was called The Treasure Thief or The Clever Thief, and it was about a pharaoh who Ramses III, I believe, who had a treasure house of jewels, and he was worried about it being stolen, and hired an architect to create a treasure house that was impenetrable. And supposedly, this was a legend that Herodotus was a storyteller as well. He wrote the histories, and supposedly Herodotus was a tourist in Egypt, and Herodotus was Greek, but he was a tourist in Egypt. And while he was a tourist, his tour guide supposedly told him this legend of the treasure thief. And so I bring that story to life from 2,500 years ago when Herodotus wrote it down in his histories. So it's a lovely, wonderful story. Oh, it has a great twist to it. And that's on our, if I may say, we have an award-winning CD called The Magic Carpet, Songs and Stories from Mesopotamia and Ancient Egypt. So that's the kind of deep dive of research that we did. And we spent an entire year reading the literature under the guidance of different professors and the education director at the University of Chicago, and poring over the exhibits in the museum, learning about it, from that source. And so that's where we have this repertoire of at least a dozen stories. And then also the Egyptian Cinderella is a fairly well-known story. It's sort of in a children's book, but it had a slightly different color in the original version. Where the origin of the Egyptian Cinderella had her as possibly being a prostitute in that early version of that story. So it was fascinating. I love research. I love history. I love learning about these things. So I hope that answers your question as to.
It does. So let's use this Cinderella as an example. When you find a story like the Egyptian Cinderella, and you find out in the early versions that she was a prostitute, what's your process of taking that core material that you've built up, that you've read about, and you've been presumably taking notes on, and all the rest of it? How do you then turn that into a story? And how do you decide which bits that you keep and which bits you discard?
Well, I work orally. Thank you. That's a very good question. That's actually a great question. I'm very process oriented. I think process is even more fascinating than the result. And I love the process, the journey. And I work orally. I'm sorry, but I must digress. So when I was back in Los Angeles and I was doing theater with the Women's Theater Festival and so on, there was a wonderful producer, and she was doing a Cayley, believe it or not. And I was the Irish poet from the 9th to the 19th century. And I remember doing very, very early research on the early bardic tradition. And one of the things that stuck with me, whether it's true or I don't know, but bards, if they were truly bards, they were sent into a cave for a year with no pen and no paper. And they were to orally create the best poetry that they could create. And when they felt that their poetry was in perfect form, Then they were given pen and paper so they could write it down.
Oh, wow.
And in a way, that is an answer to your question, because it is my process. So I will read, and this is true for Griff, I will read many, many versions of these stories. I will say them out loud. And then what kind of resonates in my mouth and my ears winds up. And then as I tell it, the parts that need to be told assert themselves. The ones that don't seem to fall away. Somehow the ones that don't stick in my memory fall away. And as I say it over and over again, I pick out certain language or certain phrases, or I have the imagery. And as storytellers and bards historically did, we do change things. We tweak them. It's a living process. So, once it's written down, it's sort of set in stone, but so many storytellers will do their own version of it. Even when we do the Hans Christian Andersen stories, it's, our own interpretation, our own take on it.
Right.
So I will say it and say it and say it. And then what seems, and of course, you have to know your audience. And so depending on your audience, it depends on how bawdy you want to be. And some audiences want you to be bawdy. There are bawdy tales and, whatever. And then, there are different age ranges. And so you have to sort of adjust. And you have to be able to read your audience and do that. So I might have alternate endings, or I might have slight phrases that maybe I would leave in or take out, depending on where I'm telling it.
And how long does that? So, I know it varies from story to story, but we'll use that Egyptian Cinderella. So that was, for those that don't know the Egyptian Cinderella, it's a similar length to the French Cinderella. But how long would a story like that, a story like that, take you to research and then bring up to the point of where it's ready for the stage?
Well, I never think anything is finally ready, because I'm always,
you know what I mean?
I'm deadline driven. If I have a job and I have a show, then it gets done pretty quickly. It just, I'm used to doing theater. So sometimes you have to learn a whole new show in a week, or you have to step in as an understudy, or something happens and you have to do something very, very quickly. I could work 24 hours on it or 12 hours on it, so in a very condensed, intense way. So certain things grow in me, and it depends on, how satisfied I am with something, but it could take a year. Like most of the Egyptian Mesopotamian things took a year to really hone and make it develop. And the Grimm show, I have been performing the Grimm show for 20 years. So with I performed with Dan for 16, where we toured and we did all these kinds of things, and then on my own. So I've been telling some of these stories more than 15 years, and with each telling, it's slightly different. But Margaret, I think it was Margaret Reed MacDonald or some other people said, you don't own a story until you tell it 50 to 100 times. And when I do workshops, and you could tell a beautiful story, and if you're a very facile storyteller and a professional teller, sure, you could read it in the morning and tell it at night, and it probably sounds fine. But for me, really, if I've told it so many times, then I feel that if I were to guide a new storyteller, I would tell them, you don't really own it until you tell it 25, 50 times.
Yeah, that's I would definitely agree with that. I would. When you get to the point when you're about to perform on stage, whether it's a new story or a story you've been working on for a while, or a story you've been performing for a while, like it's one of those 100 told stories. Do you still get the jitters? Do you get the jitters at all? Did you ever get the jitters?
Oh yes.
Nervous? Yeah.
Yes. I remember having an acting teacher. I studied acting professionally as well. And I remember having an acting teacher, and I was doing a scene from Genet's The Maids. And I remember we were doing it for a class, and I must have worked on it, very intensely and rather quickly, but I don't know if you have to edit this out. But he said, you were working on ass energy. And the intensity of it. So, but sometimes it's the energy that takes away the jitters because you're just like in the zone, and
Yeah.
it's like the air changes when you're really so involved in what you're doing. The air changes. Yeah, I prepare. I do tongue twisters. I do breathing exercises. I do vocal exercises before I go on stage. So I have a method of preparation. And sure, I get a little nervous, a little concerned, and I probably was much more so earlier in my career.
Yeah.
But I do feel that I'm a trooper and I'm pretty safe on stage. And I have had opportunities in plays where other actors forgot their lines completely, and I had to improvise or, sort of run with the thing. And that's also pretty exciting, when you do
it is.
live.
Yes.
That's what's going to happen. So, I definitely do get a bit of the jitters, but I am not stage fright.
Right. If you start to lose an audience, which hopefully that never happens to you, but sometimes it does happen to us when we're doing a thing. Do you have a trick for trying to pull them back in again? Like have a conniption fit, stamp your foot and wave your hands.
Well, thankfully, I can't remember when that happened recently. But when you get one's attention, sometimes it's by being quiet.
Yeah.
Just stopping or speaking very softly, which makes people pay more attention. But sometimes, and it's hard to perform outdoors because sometimes if you're outdoors, people are not seated, they're moving back and forth. So I find that, again, if you have something that makes noise or music or maybe some sort of a costume bit or something, certainly a good backdrop if you have a focal point while performing, that helps to bring the eye to you. But sometimes you never know. You could have an unruly, completely undisciplined group of school children, and you're in some sort of auditorium or whatever, and all they want to do is eat candy or run around, and there's like no hope for that. That's it. Has this ever happened to you?
Yeah, well, yeah. Again, the trick that you talked about is getting quiet. If there are unruly kids, then I'll go and have a quiet word with them. If the I try to get to them before the teachers do, because sometimes the teachers just, there's like, meh, stop making a noise, and that doesn't help at all, I don't think. And so I'll go over and I'll talk to the kids who are being unruly and see if there's a way that they'll work with me on this, and that they'll, will you set a good example for the other kids, because they do look up to you, whether you know that or not. And I want this to be the best. I want it to be the best for you as a listener, and I want it to be best for everybody else. And you can help me do that, And so there are things that I do along those lines. And if a taser, that helps.
I just thought of something else that I do. I also teach a workshop on this, about bringing people literally into your story.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I will actually sometimes perhaps bring a child up on stage with me and speaking lines. So if the story lends itself to a character who speaks, I might have the whole audience. It's really good if you start getting them to do a chant or to repeat a line, and then everybody gets focused again to do that, or the old, technique of hey, ho, or crick, crack, or something like that. But I remember once I was doing a residence school, and for some reason, I don't understand teachers who make their children be so quiet or stand in a line or fold their hands or whatever. I know I was doing a program, and this one little boy might have been on the spectrum or something, and he was under the table and he was banging his head, and he was just like banging. And I happened to have had a shaker with me. So I asked him if he would be my rhythm section. So I gave him the shaker, and I asked him to just shake it on a certain rhythm while I was telling the story. And it worked really well. So I think that if there's a way to engage a student, give them a task, have them be part of your story, that could work. You could also have a pitfall of, you think you're getting somebody who's going to cooperate with you on stage, and they're just a big cut up, and all they want is, all this attention. So, it's not always perfect, but if you have these techniques, and if you're open and you're much more tolerant of this sort of other behavior than teachers are, you can pretty much win them over, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. So talking about shakers and stuff, and the fact that you played the violin when you were younger, I'm assuming that you don't play it anymore, or do you?
No, I wish I did. When I lived in Chicago, I actually went to the Old Town School of Folk Music and had this fantasy that I could be a country fiddler and like tell stories and fiddle a little bit, And I did take a few like fiddle one and fiddle two, and I enjoyed it very much. But again, I don't have a very good ear, and when you play fiddle, you really are not supposed to use music. I read music, so my teacher was very kind and gave me the score, and I could read it and I could do it. But I realized I couldn't. I try to bring sounds and other instruments, or the djembe, the it's also known as a finger piano, but that's not the right term for it, or
Right.
shakers or noisemakers. Yeah, right. And so I love collecting exotic instruments. And when I travel around the world, I do bring back culturally interesting different instruments, and I try to incorporate them if I can.
No, so I've seen pictures of you holding drums, but do you actually play them, or was that?
Well, when I was doing work with Dan, I did actually, because there was a part of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian stories where he was playing something else, and I was doing a little bit of drumming. And I even have an Egyptian frame drum. I rubbed it. There was a way that it incorporated with the story. And I create rhythmic chants, even in the Cinderella, on the Egyptian Cinderella. She does three things. And I always look for a way to create an audience participation within the story. So if I can remember it, she washes the linen, she grinds the grain, and she weeds the garden. And so I created a chant, and I have the audience do it, and that could be a drum beat or your hand of, because she slaps the fabric on rocks in the Nile River, and that's how she was washing the linen. And people used to, rub clothing on rocks. So it was like, wash the linen, weed the grain, wash the linen, weed the garden, grind the grain. Wash the linen, weed the garden, grind the grain. So if I had some sort of a drum, I could just use my hands. But if it was more effective to have that sound, I would use that within it.
Nice.
And then for accents, like if the top of the chest in the juniper tree crashes, I would maybe take a mallet and bang a drum so that I have that sound effect, when the lid just crashes shut.
Do you use vocal sound effects much?
What do you mean?
Well, like, for example, if you're pouring a glass of wine, you might be like, or, if a tree's falling down, it might be. Do you ever, or is that just a boy thing?
No. So when I do the real Sleeping Beauty, and she creeps up the staircase, and she sees a door she's never seen before, and she opens it, it goes, the door opens. So occasionally I will use it, and or the lady beckons her, and I'll change my voice. Come in, my dear. So so I do use it, but very sparingly.
Right, that's cool. Everyone has their own technique, which is, Elizabeth Ellis doesn't do any of that, but she can. The way that she tells her stories, just you just fall into her lap to listen to them. They're amazing.
Yeah, I love what you just did. I love the wine, and I love the sounds that you were making. I think that was great.
Well, yeah, I was just me as a kid. Used to imitate sounds all the time. I used to watch all the cartoons and try and mimic them, all the sound effects that they would use. Is there anything that you know now that you wish that you knew when you first started?
In storytelling?
In storytelling, yeah.
Not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not really sure what if I knew then what I knew now. Maybe what the thing that surprises me. I mean, the journey has surprised me tremendously, and
Becoming a storyteller.
well, where it has taken me, where you create, as a storyteller, or an actor, you create something out of nothing. You create something out of complete thin air. And my storytelling has taken me to Japan and China and Ireland and England, and it's fascinating, So I didn't know any of this when I started out. So it's been an interesting look back to say, oh, I didn't even know that this is the possible place that storytelling could take me. So it's been a delightful surprise. It's not anything I would have known in the very beginning. But maybe, that maybe had I known other tellers who had gone elsewhere, maybe I would have tried to pursue it sooner. But, it happened, and I'm completely in awe of where this journey has taken me. It's a delight, a surprise. I hope my journey continues. And
too, but we're not going to end the interview just like that. And that sounds like you're ending the interview right there.
Right.
I hope it continues to do so. Thank you. Bye. So, have you had any like majorly challenging moments in your storytelling that have looking back on them now that you found that there's this, you've learned from that like really bad situation? For example, when I opened up a set with Edgar Allan Poe's Black Cat, 5 people walked out. And I learned that I should not have opened up with the Black Cat, but I should have gained the audience trust beforehand. So have you done anything like that? Have you, or something happened at a gig that you've like recovered from and learned from that? And you can say no.
No, I'm it could be the old brain just can't remember it, but I'm just trying to think. I think there might have been one of the Mesopotamian programs where usually the audience who comes to these programs are very primed. They're knowledgeable, they're interested, it's for a particular program. And I think maybe once there's a very long and convoluted story that I start with, and then Dan does this fabulous story song about how to make a mummy. It's brilliant, this song that he created. And this is authentic research. There are 7 stages in how to make a mummy. And you have 10 motions with it. You wrap the mummy, you wrap, and that's how you make mummy. And then, you stick a little hook in your nose, a little iron hook in your nose, and you scrape out the brains, scrape. Anyway, it's a winner. People walk out of our shows singing this song. And I think we should have started with it. So I think had we started with it and then I went into this more convoluted story, the temperature in the room would have been different. And we always bring it back at the end. So maybe that was one particular audience where perhaps, had we gone right into the song, we would have had them a little bit more engaged at the beginning. But once we bring out that song, it's magic. It's really quite amazing.
That's brilliant. Yeah. So some of the songs that that you think are like really simple, that they end up being something that is really powerful at the same time as well, in the way that it draws people in.
We were hired very gratefully for the Chicago Public Libraries had a summer reading program, and they were very supportive of professional storytellers. And they would often tie in a theme to a museum, a local museum. And Dan and I were awarded several of these summer reading programs. And one of them, by the way, King Tut exhibit was at the Field Museum. We wound up being hired. We did 40 shows in 4 weeks of the Magic Carpet, 3 shows a day at 11, 2, and 6. I mean, it was incredible. And then we were just
hard work.
We were just so lucky that the Magic Carpet fit their theme that summer, the Egyptian theme.
So Judith, when you're in this whole world of storytelling, what really lights up your eyes? What floats your boat?
Well, again, I love telling personal stories. I love engaging. It's been so long during COVID that you're really in front of a live audience. So the energy of being in front of a live audience and hear them take the journey with you and gasp at moments, or I hate slasher movies. I do not like scary, horrible movies, but I love to make an audience jump when I tell a scary story or a grim tale or a jump tale. So that what floats my boat is the live, in the moment interaction, a visceral response back and forth, that partnership with the audience, and how they so really shape the story. That it's very often their energy that makes the story new and fresh and different with every telling. And so that's what floats my boat, and I can't wait to get back to live. I have to say the internet and Zoom has been a remarkable door opener in that we can have people from all around the world participate, and it's so wonderful to share those different voices. But I suppose that live, that's my love of theater too, just being in the moment and being live in front of an audience with some sort of a connection.
No, that's great. Let's talk about that, the whole live streaming and all that kind of stuff, because this is something that we've all performers, not just storytellers and actors, but like all performers have had to deal with since March of 2020, and we're now in October of 2021. How have you dealt with it? Is it something that you, and we don't have to get into the technical side of it, but like the actual the performance side of it, how have you tackled that?
With my very first time having to do something on Zoom, or I think I was actually using QuickTime, I had to record a story for Theater in Exile, run by a wonderful director, Mara Mills. And I had to record myself in front of the camera. And I'm so technologically challenged that overwhelms me. But the actual process, I've done movies and television, and so being in front of a camera is something that I do have experience with. But when I have to deal with the technology and turn on my computer or get the picture right, I am completely devastated. It's just overwhelming. But the actual zooming and sitting here and realizing that I have to look into this little green dot, it took some getting used to. It really did take getting used to at the beginning. It's very different when you're on a set and you ignore the camera and the cameraman is who's responsible for shooting you properly, or the sound guy is responsible for you to sound, really good. Doing my own technology is not great, but the actual sitting down now, like talking to you, or telling a story online, was a learning curve, but not insurmountable.
Yeah. So the difference between, working with a TV crew, or being on stage with an audience, the TV crew, the cameraman, the sound people, if there's a director there, they're all they can be the audience even if they're the only people in the room. Whereas now, when we're doing it on Zoom, invariably we're on our own. We're not, we might have, you might have your husband sitting in the room with you. I don't know. Or maybe that would be a distraction for you, but we do it.
Right. No, he's not. He's usually far gone. I don't have him with me. When we do this. Right. There was something I did learn. So I'm used to standing up and telling stories. And in the very, very beginning, I think maybe one of the Hans Christian Andersen stories I told 2 summers ago, I think I did the first one standing up. And then I realized that this genre really allows you to just sit and be a talking head. So that it is a more casual, close, intimate medium than I think I understood. So that I learned that it's okay just to sit at your desk. You can be animated, you could use accents, you could change your voice, but you didn't have to stand up. And I think that I learned in this medium of being all alone in my room with just this computer on and, having to look into the camera and that you should just sit still and be able to be as real and connected as you can, and you could bring it down. So that I learned. It's the difference between doing stage, cinema, and television. And this is television. It's a small box, and so your gestures and movements have to be smaller.
Right.
But that this is a very informal and casual experience, and that the audience has been educated also, I think, by watching so many Zoom programs, that this is now acceptable to just be casually chatting, talking, and to be as real as possible.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think the audience has come a long way. And I think also that's especially true of young people who have been, like, you know, cast into Zoom and Google Meets and on all that kind of stuff for classrooms, right? And you can't always mute them, or you couldn't at the beginning at least, right? And so they had to learn to, you know, be quiet and listen in a completely different way than it would be in the classroom. You know, you can't whisper to people sitting next to you because the people, you know, there's nobody sitting next to you. And if you try and whisper to someone online, everybody else can hear it. There's no, like, which is, it's been an interesting ride for sure.
I've actually seen some very successful theatrical Zoom programs. Some of my friends are in theater companies, and they have actually translated a play. They've done a play online, and it's kind of very clever, where they might have a prop that they pass, you know, here, and you sitting next to me picks it up because you have one in your house to do it. So they've figured out a way to make it work a little more theatrically. But I think in the storytelling world, we have adjusted to sitting down and just speaking, you know, in this sort of, you know, sort of mid-chest up position.
Yeah. But yeah, I've also found that, I mean, I still, for me, I still do a lot of my stuff standing up, but I have a separate camera which is raised up on a tripod when I'm standing up. When I'm watching the shows that I'm in, you know, watching the other performers, I go to my laptop, which is at my eye level when I'm sitting down. So I kind of do both. But yes, there is the ability to perform. I like having my chest open to get the breath.
Right.
Have you done any live performances since, you know, in-person performances?
Yes. So a year ago, Halloween, I did a Grimm show at our local library that's down the road, and it was outdoors. And so that was October of 2020. And so that was a live experience, and people brought their chairs. They actually used paint and made circles, and people sat within those circles. So that was one. And then when I was just in Chicago 3 weeks ago, Margaret Burke does an outdoor program called Backroom Stories, which she used to have in a restaurant, but this was outdoors. And so she knew I was coming to Chicago, and she was gracious enough to invite me to perform live. So this is just a month ago, and Megan Wells was there and a few other people. And I got to tell a personal story on a little improvised stage with a red velvet curtain behind me to a very nice audience of about 60 people there. And we had friends who were actually visiting from Detroit who came along that night. And so it was very thrilling. So this was a personal story, so it was a different experience, and it was wonderful. So that was 2 in the last year and a half of telling a live in-person story. And it was very safe, and it was outdoors, and it was wonderful.
Did you find that your in-person telling with an audience has been affected by doing this Zoom stuff for about a year and a half, 2 years?
I don't know. I hadn't been thinking about that. Do you find that has been true for others?
I found it's true for me because I used to move around an awful lot. You know, I used to bounce all over the place when the story allowed for it. And I have found that I've become a lot more sedentary.
I see. I see.
I've been sitting down, mentally sitting down and performing and not moving around as much as I might have done, not using the lower half of my body as I might have done in the past.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I was
usually...
halfway through a show and I was like, wait, there's this thing that I used to do.
So do you
What was
use
it now?
So do you use a mic like a headset?
Yeah, I use a headset, lavalier. I use a headset or wireless. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't usually. I'm usually standing behind a microphone on a pole, so I'm not really running around a lot. There's an occasion I'd like to do it more. I'd like to have a headset, but that's not usually how I perform. So I'm sort of in this one space anyway.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So how do you feed yourself artistically?
I'm sorry, say it again.
How do you feed yourself artistically?
Lots of chocolate. No.
No, that's the mental thing.
I like immersing myself in attending. When it was live, I would attend the theater and go to performances and see if I can interact with colleagues, get together and do things like that. So how I feed myself as an artist is to be open to other experiences that have to do with all kinds of art forms. I also love going to museums, and I am, creative with my hands as well. So I've taken up a hobby during, resurrected an old hobby of making earrings underneath COVID. So
yeah, I've seen some of those earrings. They're really kind of cool.
We're on only audio, but I'm wearing some pumpkins that I made today.
I like those.
But I like to recycle and repurpose, and it's very hard to throw things out when I could see another creative and artistic life for them. So my craftiness, doing crafts and things like that,
right,
working with my hands, actually feed my poetry or my storytelling, or stories grow out of that. So I think trying to be as creative and surrounding myself with art helps feed my artistic soul. I read a lot too, still reading, and or if I can, going to museums, which are opening up again. When I was just in Chicago, we went to the opera live, and I went to my first play at the Goodman Theater in a year and a half. So that helps to feed my, and doing things, even rehearsing, feeds my artistic soul. What about you?
Me? Oh, I read a lot as well. Most of it's folk and fairy tales, but I do some art stuff as well every once in a while. So do you still read the mystery novels that you read as a kid now, or have you found different genres that you like to read?
Well, I'm a big fan of Jack Reacher, of the Lee Child. In fact, I've read every one of them, and I'm on the waiting list for the new book that's coming out. But my husband and I both love mysteries. We own over 750 mysteries, and we used to have a card catalog because we had this fantasy we were going to lend them out and get them back. And I think in the beginning we lent them out, but we didn't get them back, so we don't lend them. But I have whole collections of Nero Wolfe or Parker or whatever, and all of these on my shelves. I have thousands and thousands of books, but we love mysteries. We take them out of the library. My husband is much more, he's a more, well, it's not a vociferous reader, but he can read much faster, and he can finish more books than I can. And he reads everything. I mean, now he's into graphic novels, and they're fascinating. We just read Crumbs, and he just read I can't remember the name of it. It's a trilogy, but it was supposedly the very first graphic novel written, and it was in 3 volumes. So he will read nonfiction, fiction, but he was always a mystery buff, and he's the one who really turned me on to reading mysteries. So I still read mysteries. And it's funny, our library has books that they're discarding, and they had a couple of Nancy Drew mysteries there, and I picked them up to send to my great niece. So I would like to get her, started on them as well. I asked her mother, and she said yes, she would like to have them. So they're ready to
That's really fun.
So the mystery that we think is the best mystery of all time is Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, Tey, and she's British. And I believe she only wrote 3 books. And she wrote Brett Farr and something else, and Daughter of Time. And I think you'd like it very much, and I highly recommend it.
Well, I might have to go to my local library to find it and read it. I'm not a big mystery reader, but I do read them every once in a while, and I always enjoy them.
So this, what the subject matter of this is, it is trying to prove that Richard III did not kill his nephews, and so it's a historical mystery with real research, but it's a lot of fun. The premise is that a detective has broken his leg and he's in the hospital, and he says that he could look at a face and he could tell you whether that person is innocent or guilty. So his friend comes with all these photos, some contemporary, some old and classic, and she brings the picture of Richard III, and he doesn't know it's Richard III, and he says innocent. And then when he starts doing research, it's a wonderful mystery called Daughter of Time. So you might.
I'll have to look that one up. That does sound really good, actually. So if there was a storyteller that you've not met, living or dead, that you could meet magically, who would that storyteller be, and what would you ask them?
I suppose I'm sure there's a better, more in-depth answer than this. So if I were to meet a storyteller, living or dead, I would probably like to have a conversation with Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm.
Ooh, I like that.
Even though I have done research and I know that they collected these stories where young women came to them, actually in French salons, that these young women were telling stories like a storytelling guild meeting in a way, entertaining each other. They didn't go out and get the stories from the peasants. I would still like to know maybe what their favorite stories are. And goriest and bloodiest stories, and if they like the ones I like. Did they like the juniper tree and the real Sleeping Beauty and the children play at slaughtering as much as I do?
Wow, that's so cool. That's really cool. No one's actually said the Brothers Grimm. I like that idea a lot. That's a really cool answer. Yeah.
I'd like to pick their brain, and maybe if I were so bold, I might even do one of their stories for them and see what they think about my interpretation.
I know, because you would be bringing a completely different lens to it, wouldn't you?
If they could time travel, it would be this 21st century, Well, that's what we say, actually. That's a little blurb on the back of our CD. So we would like people to gain a new, bloodier perspective on your childhood fairy tales. And this mayhem is accompanied by music skillfully sung and evocatively played on Renaissance lute, set to 16th century ballad tunes, complementing 19th century German stories, and transformed through Judith and Dan's 21st century intellects and interpretation.
Wow, I like that. That's a really good.
So revisit your childhood through the lenses of blood-spattered spectacles.
I'm going to ask you one more question. This is going to probably be the toughest question.
Okay.
You ready? What's your favorite breakfast? Where would your favorite place be to eat it? And who would you eat it with?
I'm such a creature of habit. To be truthful, every morning I have Dannon's coffee yogurt with raw flaxseed and bran. And I have developed quite a taste for coffee. But if I am indulging, I actually love a breakfast buffet. And I love grazing and, having a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I used to love Eggs Benedict and, with Hollandaise sauce, and I like creamy things as well. So French toast is pretty good too. And whom would I have it with? I think that, honestly, I don't get to see my children that much. So I would love to have a brunch with my adult children and my husband, and being able to share that kind of breakfast together, whether we're out at a restaurant or
where in the world would you take them to have this hollandaise?
Well,
Eggs Benedict.
They're because of COVID, you really can't go to buffets anymore. But
well, pretend that COVID's gone and we're all back in
I would have to find a restaurant. There was a restaurant in. Well, what I think about is I have cousins who live in Florida at these different residence, complexes, and they have a clubhouse, and the clubhouse has this very elaborate brunch where I remember going once or twice. It's not an everyday thing, but the panoply of the food was extraordinary, and you can go a little crazy. I go a little nuts with a buffet, but I love French toast, and I love omelets, and I love sushi, and I love have all these things together. So maybe a lovely restaurant that serves a buffet brunch. But on the other hand, my husband makes a terrific omelet, and you too, Simon, if you're ever in the neighborhood, please come over for brunch. And so even having a brunch in my own home of a really nice omelet with mushrooms and onions and garlic and cheese, a couple of eggs whipped up together would be really terrific. So
that'd be great. Well, Judith, thanks so much for spending this time with me. I greatly appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your life and your experience with our listeners here. I hope they've enjoyed it as much as I do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thanks again, Judith. Take care. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Judith Heineman. If you did enjoy this podcast, be sure to check out other episodes. And if you think I should interview a certain folk and fairy tale myths and legends storyteller, send me an email. You can find me and my work on Facebook and on my website, Simon Brooks Storyteller, and on Instagram, Simon M. Brooks. Diamond Scree, yep, that's me, the English fella and storyteller. A shout out to Chris Jedd for creating and recording and letting me use this wonderful music for my podcast. His band is called Blackpool Mecca. Check those dudes out, they're pretty darn good. You can help keep this podcast alive and support my craft by becoming one of my Patreons and paying anything from $1 for an episode that you enjoyed or to a regular monthly subscription. In return, you get extras, early release and exclusive content on my work. www.patreon.com/Simon Brooks. If you do become a patron, I'll mention your name on the next podcast. If you don't want to become one of my patrons, that's okay, I understand it. We're all in crazy times right now. If you don't join the tribe, then do something that you could do, please. Leave a review on Podbean, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, wherever you found this episode. It doesn't take long and it helps, not just me, but others find and enjoy this podcast too. Thanks for being here with me. I know that there are a lot of other places you could be. I really appreciate it. Until next time, be healthy, be happy, and share the stories you love. Cheers. Simon out.
It's just a story. Just a story. Yep.